In this lecture, we'll be discussing Precambrian Earth and life history. We'll start with listing what the periods of the Precambrian eon were. We'll discuss the origin of the oceans, origin of the atmosphere, origin of the continents, the beginnings of life on the planet, and then we'll discuss early animals towards the end of the Precambrian. So we have here the geologic time scale, and we see the Precambrian is the vast majority of Earth time, being from the formation of the Earth 4.6 billion years ago, or 4,600 million years ago, all the way up to a little bit more than 500 million years ago. We have the Precambrian that's broken down into three sub-periods, the first being the Hadean, followed by the Archean, and finally the Proterozoic. And so in discussing Precambrian Earth history, we're actually discussing the majority of the history of the planet. Right? Though it's the majority, we know less about it than the most recent 500 million years because this information has been lost through the rock cycle and other processes. A lot of important things happened during the Precambrian, including, as we mentioned, the oceans, formation of the oceans, atmosphere, and the continents. And so that's what we'll talk about now. First, we'll start with the oceans, the origin of the oceans. So the origin of the oceans is rooted back to the Hadean, which is the first part of the Precambrian, which stands from 4.6 to 4 billion years ago. And so all the water in the ocean. So where did all this liquid water come from? It wasn't originally on the planet, considering that the planet formed from materials condensing in space, and the rock was so hot that it was molten, and you know, a molten body is too hot to hold liquid water. It would just boil off in the space. So once Earth cooled and solidified, there were still some gases trapped in its interior that were trapped in the rock as it began to solidify. You can imagine these gases were gases that were dissolved in the liquid as it was solidifying. And these gases began to escape from Earth's interior, as you could think of one of the stages of that process known as density stratification, where the dense materials go to the center and then least dense go to the exterior, while gases are the least dense. And so they're seeping their way out to the exterior of the planet. And these gases would escape through volcanoes and volcanic vents. So we see a picture of some volcanism here. And so you see that cloud of gas. And one of the largest volcanic gases by volume is water vapor. And so you can see different volcanic gases. We have some water vapor goes to the atmosphere, that would become to the ocean. And then we have hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. Those are the most common volcanic gases. And so the ocean was, once that water vapor was up at the atmosphere, it condensed out eventually, and it accumulated as a liquid, filling in depressions in Earth's surface. So that's how the ocean came to form. But we know whenever water vapor condenses, it is fresh water, right? Because no dissolved solids go with water as it's in a vapor form. So how did the ocean become salty? Well, it became salty from being in contact with the rock and chemically weathering that rock, dissolving the rock. And so as those minerals dissolved into the ocean, it became salty. And that's still true today. So fresh water falls as rain onto land, and as that water runs as runoff through streams and rivers on the surface and as groundwater, it's dissolving some rock. And then by the time it gets to the ocean, all those dissolved minerals accumulate in the ocean, making the ocean salty. Well, the origin of the atmosphere. So the origin of the atmosphere and the origin of the ocean are similar, right? Occurred during the same time, during the Hadean. And this atmosphere is the thinnest layer of Earth. It's a really tiny layer. It's a layer of gas that is held to Earth's surface by Earth's gravity. There was a period of time where Earth had no atmosphere. So early in Earth's existence, it was too hot for gas to be held to its surface because the heat caused the gas to boil off into space. But once Earth cooled to the point where Earth's gravity was able to hold the gas to its surface, a thin layer of gas accumulated around its surface, forming the atmosphere. Where did this gas come from? Okay, so today, our atmosphere is much different from early Earth's atmosphere. Okay, so today our atmosphere has nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, this little thin slice, argon, and all the gases. Right? But where did all this gas come from? Well, it came from volcanism. So gases escaping Earth's interior, just like the water vapor that would form the ocean escaping Earth's interior. All the gases that would form the early atmosphere came from Earth's interior too. Mainly nitrogen, water, and carbon dioxide. Those were the three main components of the early atmosphere. So that's a big difference from our current atmosphere, which you can see that oxygen is a large portion of it. Oxygen was not part of the early atmosphere. So looking at carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you can see that there is so on the y-axis here, we have the concentration of various gases as their percentage. And on the x-axis, we have time in billions of years. So this is going towards present day. And this is going backward in time. And so you can see the early atmosphere had a lot of water vapor, it had a lot of carbon dioxide, and it had a lot of nitrogen. But you can see as time goes on, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it decreases significantly. But where did all that carbon dioxide go? Part of the answer lies in where did all this water vapor go? This water vapor quickly disappeared from the, relatively speaking, from the atmosphere, because that water vapor in the atmosphere would become the ocean. Remember, once the Earth was cooling, once the surface of the Earth was cool enough for liquid water to accumulate on it, all of the water vapor in the atmosphere, not all of it, most of the water vapor in the atmosphere condensed out and accumulated on Earth's surface as the ocean. Once the ocean was in place, then carbon dioxide began to dissolve into the ocean. Because carbon dioxide very easily dissolves into water, thus we use it, we use carbon dioxide to carbonate our beverages. And so later on, that carbon dioxide that remained in the atmosphere and dissolved into water would be used by organisms, photosynthetic organisms, which consume carbon dioxide. So photosynthetic bacteria, algae, and then later on plankton that make exoskeletons out of calcium carbonate, which would also absorbs carbon dioxide. So a lot of that carbon dioxide that was originally in Earth's atmosphere is now locked up in limestone, the calcareous, the calcite-bearing rock that forms from the lithification of the remains of organisms that make their shells out of calcium carbonate. Because in calcium carbonate is calcium, carbon, and oxygen. And the carbon and the oxygen comes from the carbon dioxide. So when we find limestone around us and the materials made out of limestone, like cement, right? The carbon and the oxygen in that material was originally once in the atmosphere a long time ago. It's not oxygen. So we noted that in Earth's early atmosphere, there was no oxygen. So Earth was an inhospitable planet to animals in its beginning, since animals need oxygen to react with their food, to metabolize it. We know this because of the presence of minerals like pyrite and magnetite, which can only form in environments that are lacking oxygen. So these mineral deposits tell us that the Earth's atmosphere and the ocean were free of or lacked free oxygen gas. So where did the oxygen come from? Well, about 3.5 billion years ago, photosynthetic bacteria appears in the ocean. Then 2.1 billion years ago, photosynthetic algae. And in the process of photosynthesis, the organism absorbs CO2 and water and sunlight, and it produces organic molecules, and it gives off oxygen as a byproduct. So just as we give off CO2 as a metabolic byproduct, plants give off, and photosynthetic organisms in general give off oxygen as a metabolic byproduct. And so the arrival of these photosynthetic organisms on Earth, these bacteria and algae, they produce oxygen and oxygenate the atmosphere, which making it possible for animal life to evolve on the planet. So if it were not for the bacteria and algae in the Precambrian oceans photosynthesizing away, producing all this oxygen, we're not here right now. So where did the, quick check, the oxygen in the atmosphere come from? Animals on land, plants on land, one-celled animal plankton in the ocean, one-celled plant plankton and algae in the ocean. So animals on land, well, without oxygen, there cannot be no animals can't live. So it's not animals on land. So it can't be animal plankton like krill or so forth. Plants on land, well, plants on land are late. They're not for a long time they'll evolve. So it's these one-celled plant-like plankton and algae in the ocean. They produce the oxygen in our atmosphere. And so the atmosphere really becomes oxygenated in what's called the oxygen revolution in the Proterozoic, and it doesn't reach modern levels until about 2 billion years ago. And so these organisms, stromatolites, or these structures called stromatolites, are produced by photosynthetic bacteria, you can see right here. And so it's organisms like these that are responsible for producing the oxygen of our atmosphere, oxygenating our atmosphere for the first time. So we have stromatolites and photosynthetic algae like this one. So what about the continents? So the continents, their origin is in the Precambrian too. So it starts in the Hadean. And so as Earth was solidifying, we have mafic rock. It was mafic magma solidifying to form mafic rock. So originally the surface of the Earth was pretty much extensively basalt. The same type of rock found on the sea floor. Just all basalt, as these magma oceans on the surface solidified into solid rock. Right? But we know that continental rock, which is usually felsic igneous rock, which basalt is mafic, but like granite, and it's a felsic igneous rock, and metamorphic rocks like gneiss, we find these rocks that go back to 4 billion years old, 3.96 billion years old. So we know by about 4 billion years ago, there were some continental land masses in place, some continental rock, some granite, and some gneiss. That's when it began to form. And we know that there were continental land masses in place even by 4.38 billion years old, because there are zircons, which are mineral crystals that form in continental rocks found in some sandstones in Australia. So which letters represent the oldest rocks and the oldest grains within the rocks? So is it A is the oldest grains and A is the oldest rocks? No, that's not the case, because this is the beginning of Earth. Right? B, A is the oldest grains and B is the oldest rocks? No, once again, this is the beginning of Earth, A. What about C? B is the oldest grains, B is oldest rocks, should say oldest rocks. It's not, that's not correct. Answer D, B is the oldest grains and C is the oldest rocks. or answer E, A is the oldest grains, C is the oldest rocks. So we know this is the Earth. B are the oldest mineral crystals, and C are the oldest rocks. Correct answer is B. So soon after the Earth is formed, it's not long before we're having some form of continental landmass, some form of continental rocks. Okay, and so a lot of the activity that begins to produce the continents occurs during the Archean, which is the middle part of the Precambrian. So we're going to look at Archean plate tectonics. Okay, so we're looking at 4 to 2.5 billion years ago, the Archean. So what plate boundary do granite and gneiss typically form? Convergent, divergent, transform, or the edge of a continent far away from any plate boundaries? Well, the answer is a convergent plate boundary. So often on convergent plate boundaries, you can have subduction zones, right? So which subduction zones produce volcanism. So that's producing extrusive igneous rock, but not only that, but the magma beneath the surface slowly cools. That produces intrusive igneous rock, like granite. Also, the convergence is heat and pressure, which metamorphoses rock. So we find granite and metamorphic rock like gneiss typically along convergent plate boundaries. And so we find these granite and gneiss complexes that form along convergent plate boundaries that date back to the Archean on many different continental landmasses. So we also find these rocks called greenstone belts, which are metamorphosed volcanic rocks and sediments. This is telling us that in the Archean, there was a lot of volcanism that was producing extrusive igneous rock, and rock was weathering and being sediment was being generated, deposited, and lithified in sedimentary rock along the edges of these, say, like volcanic islands. And then these volcanic islands with their extrusive igneous rocks and sedimentary rocks were being slammed into other land masses, other pieces of continental crust, and being metamorphosed, forming these greenstone belts. So once again, these greenstone belts indicate the form of granite gneiss that there was a lot of convergent plate boundaries going on. So most Archean rocks are granite and gneiss complexes and these greenstone belts. Therefore, was plate tectonics happening in the Archean? Yes, and the plate boundaries of the plates were more active than today. Yes, and the boundaries of the plates were less active today. Or no, there are no plate boundaries. The correct answer is A. The fact that we don't see many sedimentary rocks from the Archean, and mostly these rocks that form along convergent plate boundaries, tells us that most edges of the plates were of the continents were active plate boundaries. So like the west coast of South America or the west coast of North America, and that we didn't have a lot of passive margins of continents like the east coast of North America or the east coast of South America, because a large amount of sedimentary rocks form there. So, so from that, we suggest that yes, plate tectonics was happening. It was much more active today. There were many more plate boundaries. So Archean plate tectonics, Earth was hotter because it was younger. Has not lost as much heat yet, so its interior is still warmer. As a result, the convection process in its mantle is faster. So the plates move faster, and there's more volcanism. And so continental boundaries without plate boundaries were uncommon. So the edges of most continents were a plate boundary mentioned. So sedimentary rocks were uncommon as well because there were not a lot of stable areas of continents for these sediments to accumulate, lithify, and form sedimentary rocks. And so the continents, they form through a process called accretion. So we have volcanism due to a subduction zone, right? Which is producing extrusive igneous rock and some intrusive igneous rock and then some sedimentary rock. But then what happens is in older volcanic landform, so which has the same types of rocks: extrusive igneous rock, intrusive igneous rock, and sedimentary rock. They collide together, and that collision metamorphoses the rock. So now we have metamorphosed rock, and usually the rocks on the exterior are the ones that get metamorphosed. So the extrusive igneous rock and the sedimentary rocks, they get metamorphosed. And so now we have just the intrusive igneous rock like granite, and then now the newly formed metamorphic rock like gneiss formed. So each time one of these convergence happens, the continental rock, it accretes or adds on. You can see how this landmass, this continental landmass, is the compilation of three smaller volcanic arcs that have all collided and accreted together. So that's how all the continents formed, is smaller fragments of continental rock, usually produced by volcanism along the subduction zone, just like, say, what's happening, how Japan is formed. So Japan, the Japanese islands, are continental rock formed from the volcanism along the subduction zone. And they get accreted and added on. That's why the continents are composed almost exclusively, well, the Precambrian parts of the continents are composed almost exclusively of igneous rock like granite and metamorphic rock like gneiss and schist, because they're formed from this process. So moving forward out of the Archean into the Proterozoic, looking at plate tectonics. So now we're at 2.5 billion to 500 million years ago. We now have larger, less active convergent plate boundaries. We begin to find rock on continental edges without convergent plate boundaries. So we're finding some sedimentary rocks, such as sandstone, shale, and limestone. So this is telling us that the Earth has cooled, plate tectonics has slowed down, we're having less convergent plate boundaries, larger plates, and we're having edges of continents that don't have an active plate boundary, in which sediments are able to accumulate and liquefy and to form large deposits of sedimentary rock. And so here's a map, and all the green and red rocks are Precambrian rocks. You see the cores of most of the continents were formed during the Precambrian. The red is exposed Precambrian rocks, and the green is Precambrian rocks that are covered by sediments and sedimentary rock. All right, so if you wanted to find some of the oldest rocks on Earth, you'd go to the red regions of this map, the exposed Precambrian rocks. And it's up here in the Canadian Shield, which we'll learn what a shield is, that the oldest rocks are found that are 4 billion years old. And so by the end of the Precambrian, the foundations of the continents were really in place. And all the brown, that's stuff that will be added later. But most of the continents were, at least their foundations were put in place by the end of the Precambrian. So now we're going to look at the title says the origin of life, but it's not really the origin of life, because, as we'll talk about, we don't know what the origin of life is. So we're going to talk about the first appearance of life. But quickly, in the 1950s, there was a famous experiment called the Miller-Urey experiment, where they were seeing if they could try to synthesize life from scratch. It's called a process called biosynthesis, to see how could life have originated on Earth, come to be. And so they're able to create amino acids, which are very simple organic molecules that are used as the building blocks for more complex organic molecules. But being able to create these amino acids from scratch, so he just took naturally occurring organic molecules that just form naturally without life, and applying some form of energy like heat, electricity, or so forth that might have occurred on early Earth. They were able to create these amino acids from those molecules. But that's like saying you're able to figure out how to cut out the blocks that the Great Pyramids of Giza are composed of. But that doesn't tell you how the pyramids were built. Like, how are those blocks assembled? How are they put together to build the pyramid? Well, we figure out how the building blocks may have been created, but how those building blocks were arranged in the appropriate manner and then begin to work together to form a living cell, living organism, is still unknown. So how life came to be on Earth is still a mystery. Science doesn't have an answer for it. You have to ask the question, did life even originate on Earth? There is one hypothesis called the spermaceti hypothesis, is that life did not originate on Earth, that Earth was seeded by microbes that were living, that came to be somewhere else in the universe, or somewhere else, more likely in the galaxy. And those microbes were on a comet, and that comet struck Earth, and Earth was seeded with that life, and Earth was a fertile planet for that life to grow and develop and evolve. So that could be the case. We don't know if life originated on Earth or somewhere else, and Earth was just seeded. So if the spermaceti hypothesis is correct, then we're all technically aliens. All right, so we don't know how life actually got its start on Earth, but from the fossil record, we have a good idea of when life first appeared on Earth. And so life first appeared during the Archean. And during the Archean, the form of life was very simple life called prokaryotic organisms. These are single cellular organisms where the cell does not have a nucleus. And they arrived in the fossil record in the Archean 3.5 billion years ago. And so up top here, this is an example of a prokaryotic cell. And here's a eukaryotic cell for comparison. So we are eukaryotes, meaning our cells have a cell nucleus, where prokaryotes lack a cell nucleus. And so they're more simple organisms, include most bacteria, okay? And the earliest form of these bacteria were cyanobacteria. They were photosynthetic bacteria. They had to be photosynthetic because there was no food to eat on the planet. They're the first form of life. Remember, food is preformed organic molecules. It's a living organism. So as animals, we have to eat other organisms, whether it be or the products of those organisms, whether it be actually consuming animals or consuming plants or consuming fungus or even protists when we eat algae. I mean seaweed. So we have to eat other organisms. But these bacteria, they were the only organisms on the planet. So they could not be animals. They could not eat food. So they had to make their own, they still eat food, but they had to make their own food through photosynthesis. So these are the stromatolites. So the evidence is we have fossils of these structures built by the stromatolites. They're still building today in some parts of the planet. You can see how the layers of these stromatolites, I discussed these several lectures ago. It was in the introduction, where the bacteria creates a sticky mat so they don't float off into the ocean, so they stay near the coastline in shallow water. And sediments adhere to that sticky mat, and then they have to migrate outside that layer of sediment and excrete a new sticky mat. And over time, it creates these layered structures, these stromatolites. So we find stromatolite fossils that date back to 3.5 million years ago. We even find fossilized imprints of cells that go back to 3.5 million years ago. So this is likely a fossil of one of the oldest organisms, or first organisms to live on this planet. There's some indirect evidence of life, like carbon isotopes, which organisms tend to concentrate like carbon isotopes. So that's not a direct observation of life, but it could be an indirect observation of life. And if those light carbon isotope deposits were from organisms, then that means that living organisms were here 3.7 billion years ago, 200 million years prior. But the oldest direct evidence that we have puts life here in the form of photosynthetic bacteria at 3.5 billion years ago. So here we have some images of some photosynthetic bacteria called the cyanobacteria. They photosynthesize, produce these things called stromatolites. And here's pictures of modern day stromatolites, see the structures. And then here's some fossilized ones. See, cut them open, you can see the layers, right, from each sticky mat that they formed. So if you could go back to the middle of the Precambrian, take a picture of life, what would you take a picture of? Nothing, bacteria-like life in algae, or bacteria-like life, algae, and fish? Well, the answer is B, just bacteria-like life. That's all you would find. So the next form of life to appear on Earth are eukaryotic cells, and they appear in the fossil record in the Proterozoic. So this is the first major evolutionary leap to occur on the planet, the evolution of the cell nucleus. It's a very significant one. So it occurs during the Proterozoic, so between 2.5 and 500 million years ago. And so this cell nucleus is important for eukaryotic cells because it acts as a central command station, and it can and it results in the cell being able to run more complex functions in these structures called organelles, like mitochondria, and we have the endoplasmic reticulum for transporting material throughout the cell. And so there's just much more structure to the cell, and so it's just a more advanced cell to begin with, and the cell nucleus allows the control of that. And so eukaryotic cells are the cells that protists, fungi, plants, and animals have. So all those organisms have evolved from these first eukaryotic organisms. So cells with a nucleus evolve about and they appear in the fossil record about 2.1 billion years ago. And so this is what, pictures of modern day single cellular eukaryotic organisms look like. And so these were the, likely what the first eukaryotes on the planet look like. So this is going back many generations. So the oldest fossils go back to 2.1 billion years ago. They're found in Michigan. They're coiled imprints of what are probable algae. And we also have more abundant fossils of algae at 2 billion years ago. So the oldest direct evidence we have puts them at 2.1 billion years ago, these eukaryotes, but we become very common by 2 billion years ago. So next, we're going to discuss early animals. So once eukaryotic cells evolved, then those eukaryotic cells, from them evolved multicellular complex organisms known as animals. We're going to discuss the beginning of animals, the conditions for fossilization, the Ediacaran fauna. Fauna means animals from the Proterozoic. We're going to just take a little foray out of the Precambrian and talk about Cambrian fauna, the Burgess shell organisms, animals. Talk about the Cambrian Explosion and Cambrian marine communities. Okay, so now keep in mind that these early animals, towards the end of the Precambrian, they're only able to evolve because of the cyanobacteria and the prokaryotic bacteria, cyanobacteria, and eukaryotic algae being around for thousands of millions, for billions of years prior to this. Billions of years of just bacteria and algae photosynthesizing away, creating oxygen and oxygenating the atmosphere. Now, that billions of years of photosynthesis is required to produce the oxygen that needs to be in place for animals to evolve. So let's start with the beginnings of animals. So you see several different organisms on the screen, so pictures. You see some are fairly recognizable, some of them maybe not so recognizable, but they look very different from each other. But the one thing they have in common is that they are all animals. That's probably fairly obvious for most of them. Some of them might be a little more interesting, like this organism down here. It's like, is that an animal? It looks kind of like a plant. Yeah, it is in fact an animal, and it lives a similar life to the earliest animals. It's a very passive life where they just filter food out of water. right? So animals don't always have to be what we typically think of as these moving, scurrying critters. Or animals can take a lot of different shapes and lifestyles. But animals first appear in the fossil record towards the end of the Proterozoic, okay? Because remember that by 2 billion years ago, oxygen levels were near modern levels. So the atmosphere is oxygenated. And so then it takes, a decent amount of time, a couple billion years, or actually about 1.5 billion years for complex animal life to evolve once the oxygen is there. So the starting point for animals are these eukaryotic cells. So algae. So the first eukaryotes are algae. From algae evolve multicellular organisms. Among those multicellular organisms are animals. And so see a cell with a nucleus is right about here. You're going to see the first animals, they arrive right around there. And so those cells with the nucleus, from them will evolve plants, animals, and fungi. And so these are all the descendants of eukaryotes, all those eukaryotic cells, plants, animals, and fungi. So the oldest animals are right around 600 million years old, right at the end of the Precambrian. Right? So which letter represents the oldest life and the oldest animals? So is it A, that letter A is the oldest life and letter A is the oldest animals? Nope, that's too early for animals. B, A is the oldest life and letter B is the oldest animals. No, this is, what's B? This B right here, this is the oldest eukaryotic cells. So A is prokaryotic cells, B is eukaryotic cells, and C is the oldest animals. So the correct answer is A is the oldest life, and C is the oldest animals. Let's answer E. So we can see it from the first appearance of life on Earth 3.5 billion years ago to basically rounding to 0.5. It took 3 billion years for animals to evolve from the first photosynthetic bacteria on the planet. 3 billion years. It's a long time, but that's a large evolutionary leap from photosynthetic bacteria to animals. What does B represent? So that's the oldest cell with a nucleus. So the oldest eukaryotic cells, that's B, about 2.1 billion years ago. So when we're looking at fossils, it's important to understand the conditions for fossilization because, you might not find fossils in a rock and be like, oh, maybe animals weren't around or maybe animals didn't live here. Or it could be that they were there and they did live and they were present, but the conditions for fossilization just were not met, right? So we have to know with conditions that fossilization occurs because that gives us information about the conditions that were present whenever the organisms were alive as well. So the conditions for fossilization are very specific, okay? And they're so specific that the chance that any particular organism is fossilized is very small, right? But because there were so many billions of organisms that have lived in the past, fossils are very common. So, basically the chance of any particular organism being fossilized is very small. But because so many organisms have lived on this planet, there are a large number of fossils that are very common. So organisms with hard body parts are much more likely to be fossilized, and they have to be buried quickly to avoid rotting or being scavenged. Examples of being buried quickly, they can either sink in the mud, buried in a sandstorm, or buried by a large amount of ocean sediment. And then over time, more and more sediment has to cover the remains. In this example down here, these are mammals that were buried in volcanic ash whenever Yellowstone erupted a couple million years ago. So the parts of the animal that didn't rot, which are usually the hard parts, a shell or some bones or teeth, they're encased in newly formed sediment. And after a long time, as the bone decays away, water with dissolved minerals in it seeps into the bone and replaces the organic matter of the bone with minerals as the bone decays away. So as the organic material decomposes, it's being at the same time replaced with mineral deposits. And the fossilization involves the dissolving and replacing of organic matter, the original organic material, sorry. And the result is this hard rock-like copy of the original. So a fossil is not the actual original material. It's basically a rock-like or mineral replicant of the material. So, this excavation site of a dinosaur fossil, there's not the actual bones. The bones, the organic matter has been replaced by minerals. And so it's now a rock in the shape of the original bone. So there's a little flow chart for the conditions of fossilization. So let's start with a dinosaur. Let's say a dinosaur dies, and we come to the first junction. Right here, is there a quick burial in mud, sand, etc. that encases the body in sediment? The answer is no. Then the dinosaur is eaten or rots and no fossil is formed. Or if the answer is yes, we move to the next condition. So do conditions exist in which the fossilization, recrystallization, and or mineralization process, which is the replacement of the organic material with minerals, processes met? Okay, those conditions involve temperature, pressure, acidity, chemical composition of the sediment, moisture levels, etc. It's very specific. If those conditions are not met, then the dinosaur still rots away and no fossil is formed. However, if those conditions are met, then water infused with minerals seeps into the bones. Over time, the original bone decays and is slowly replaced by rock-like minerals, or one mineral is replaced by another, or empty spaces are filled with minerals, and eventually a fossil is formed. So now let's look at the fossils of the oldest animals, and that takes us back to a period of time known as the Ediacaran. Ediacaran. This is the very end of the Proterozoic, still in the Precambrian, the Ediacaran. So as I said, very end of the Proterozoic, right before the Cambrian period, which was the Cambrian is the first period of the Paleozoic. So Ediacaran is 570 to 545 million years ago. And these fossils are important because they demonstrated the diversity of animals right before the Cambrian. So it gives us a sense of what animals were like before the Cambrian. So here's some illustrations of animal life during the Ediacaran. And if you look, a lot of it looks pretty foreign, right? Except there's some organisms that look very recognizable, right? Jellyfish. Come to find out, jellyfish are pretty much some of the oldest animals on the planet. They have been around for around 570 million years. So it's hard to find animals on this planet that are older or have relatives that have descendants that are still around, other than the jellyfish. So fossils of these Ediacaran animals mostly consist of molds and casts between layers of sandstone. And that's because at this time there were no durable skeletons. Okay, so the only thing there was no calcified skeleton. There was only basically cartilage. That's the only structures that they had to build skeletons out of. And these organisms probably lived in a shallow, near-shore marine environment. Whenever they died, today they would quickly be eaten, preyed upon, or decomposed by bacteria. but they were preserved because they're the first animals. There's no predators, so nothing's going to scavenge them, nothing's going to eat them. And bacteria had yet to evolve the ability to break down collagen, which is the protein that cartilage is made out of. You know, and there's also collagen in your nails and in your hair. So they decomposed very slowly. And so basically these organisms evolved before anything else, animal or bacteria, evolved to eat them. And so their bodies were preserved long enough to be fossilized. And these organisms don't fit into any modern day classification of animals, right? Because they're so different. I mean, these animals, most of them, their evolutionary lineage has disappeared. They've gone extinct. And they're very strange looking animals, right? Compared to what we're used to seeing today. Some of them were motile like this, which means they can move around, while others were sessile, and they're stuck to the ground. Like you can see some sessile animals here that just filtered food out of the water as it passed by. And there's even some evidence of worms. So these are thought to be maybe worm tunnels, which would be considered a trace fossil of worms. So worms might also be some of the oldest animals on the planet. So now we're going to move forward out of the Ediacaran, and we're going to take a step out of the Precambrian and step into the Paleozoic. And the first period of the Paleozoic is the Cambrian. Now, the Cambrian, something important happens in the Cambrian. So important that the majority of Earth time that precedes it is known as the Precambrian. Now, this shale, called the Burgess Shale, was discovered in the Rockies of Canada, the Rocky Mountains of Canada. And it was a very important paleontological discovery. So the Burgess Shale, this deposit of shale formed during the early Paleozoic, during the Cambrian period. And the fossils found in it are very important because they tell us about the conditions which were there at the time. So these animals lived on top of mud banks next to a deep basin. And it's thought that there are hostile conditions in that basin. So if animals died and drifted down there, or they went down there by accident, they were killed instantly, and no other organisms could live down there. So there were no scavengers. And so their bodies were buried and preserved. And so it's thought that this scenario set up kind of the perfect situation for creating fossils. And it gives a snapshot of what life was like in the Cambrian. So here's a picture of the actual Burgess Shale. You can see in the shale all these different fossils of organisms. So this is a Trilobite up here, and this is Anomalocaris down there. So there's a picture of a Trilobite. So Trilobites are very common fossils from the Cambrian. And this is what a typical maybe Cambrian community may have looked like. And here's another illustration of a Cambrian community. And so what do we have here? We have a lot of different organisms, still very weird looking compared to today's standards. But we have trilobites. Right? Trilobites are a type of arthropod. Right? So they have segmented bodies. They have legs. They have antennae and exoskeletons. Anomalocaris, which had it looks like here an important evolutionary development of the Cambrian. Eyes. This was an active swimmer, and you can see it has these little appendages like mandibles coming out of its front. And so these mandibles are thought to be able to manipulate food and bring it in towards its mouth. And it has eyes, so it's obviously just not feeling around and just feeding algae out of the sand, or debris out of the sand like the trilobites do. The fact that it has these structures to kind of move food toward its mouth and has eyes, it's thought that Anomalocaris may be either the first or one of the first known predators. Okay, because it would actively hunt with its eyes. There's this worm-like creature, Hallucigenia. You know how they get what these organisms are named. People that discover them get to name them, so they name them whatever they want sometimes. But this is a worm, and the important feature of this worm is its spikes. Right? Why do they have spikes? To fend off or to protect itself from predators. So that tells us that there must have been active predators during the Cambrian, that these organisms would have evolved adaptations to avoid predation. You can see these worms too. They're grazing on these other organisms. There's an Otoia. This is a type of worm, similar to a worm today. Waptia looks very similar to modern day shrimp, another arthropod. Wiwaxia, just a strange looking creature. I don't know what it looks like today. Likely, there's no descendants of it alive today. Its evolutionary lineage went extinct. Right, so we have all these, odd looking creatures in this early Cambrian communities. And so this period is known as the Cambrian Explosion, 545 million years ago. And the Cambrian Explosion marks the end of the Precambrian and the beginning of the Phanerozoic, which has the first era known as the Paleozoic. And it's because this Cambrian Explosion is animals suddenly appear in great abundance in the fossil record beginning in the Cambrian. So that's what the explosion means, the explosion of animal fossils in the fossil record. What is the most likely explanation? Is it that A, there were very few animals until the Cambrian, so there wasn't much to fossilize before that? B, sedentary rocks of Cambrian age are much more common than older sedentary rocks, so there are more rocks to find fossilized animals in. Or C, animals evolved hard parts at the beginning of the Cambrian, so they're more easily fossilized. Well, we know that there were animals prior to the Cambrian in Ediacaran because you do find some fossils. But what we find in the Cambrian animals is that they have these hard structures, these exoskeletons. They have these hard parts. And so the correct answer is C. It's in the Cambrian that exoskeletons are evolved. And those exoskeletons are much more durable and they last longer and are more likely to be fossilized. So that's why we find an abundance of animal fossils, explosion animal fossils in the Cambrian. So large animals with skeletons appear abruptly, geologically speaking. Now it still took millions of years during early Cambrian for them to evolve, but that's for a fairly short period of time with respect to geologic time. So the evolution of the exoskeleton is a huge evolutionary leap because exoskeletons have many advantages. They're very effective, so effective that the most dominant form of animal life today are arthropods, and arthropods have exoskeletons. And their arthropods are a direct descendant of some of these early Cambrian animals. So here we see modern day animals. Horseshoe crab, which is one of the oldest animals with exoskeleton. It's 500-some million years old. We have a clam. We have a snail, the shale. There's a trilobite with an exoskeleton. They're extinct. A clam, a snail, and there's a lobster. These all have exoskeletons. What's the advantages of an exoskeleton, though? Well, one is protection against predators. We know that's what exoskeletons were used for in the Cambrian because we find evidence of damaged prey. So we find fossils of organisms where their exoskeleton has been damaged due to attack from predators. We also see the existence of anti-predatory adaptations, like those spikes on the worm, the Hallucigenia. And so if we have prey evolving to these features to avoid predation. That means that there's predators around, and those exoskeletons are likely an adaptation to avoid predation. They also prevent drying out. So this allows organisms to now live in an intertidal environment. So the part of the coastline that is not submerged at low tide, but submerged at high tide. So the evolution of the exoskeleton kind of opens up the range. It increases the range of these organisms, allowing them to live in the intertidal environment. So there's three main fossils from the Cambrian, most common fossils from the Cambrian. Once again, Cambrian, the early of the Paleozoic, and these fossils are trilobites. So half of the total fauna, about 95% of fossils from the Cambrian are trilobites. So they are extremely common. They are arthropods. They're mostly bottom dwellers. There are a few swimmers and a couple plankton, they just drift in the water. And horseshoe crabs are thought to be a descendant of, or the closest living relative, not a direct descendant necessarily, the closest living relative to these trilobites. They live a very similar life. They just kind of move across the sea floor, filtering different organic particles and algae stuff out of the sand, eating it out of the sand. They're grazers. Brachiopods are the other dominant fossil of the Cambrian. They attached to the sea floor, kind of like an oyster does today, and they are filter feeders like oysters and clams. They take water in, it filter the organic particles out of it as food, and then push out the filtered water. And then we have primitive sponges. So sponges, sponges filter water for food as well. And the sponges, they constructed simple reefs. They are attached to the sea floor, and they are filter feeders. And like today, sponges forming these reefs create a little ecosystem. So what characteristics do the three most common Cambrian fossils share? They all have hard body parts. They all live in shallow oceans, both A and B, or neither A nor B. Both A and B. They have hard parts that are more easily preserved. They live in a shallow ocean where there's a lot of sediment being deposited, so they're likely to be buried. So looking at some marine communities, Cambrian marine communities. So animal life in the Cambrian was relegated to a very narrow range of habitats, basically just shallow coastal marine. Right? There was no life on land. There was no life on land. There was no life in the open ocean. There was only life on the shallow coastal sea floor. Right? So no complex reefs, no deep burrowers, no excellent swimmers. Most moving animals were just sediment feeders, except for the few organisms that are thought to have been predators. So which one of these is a primitive sponge? Answer is E, right here. So this is primitive sponge, primitive structure, filter feeder. All the other organisms are modal, they're moving. See this jellyfish. Jellyfish, this is a leftover from the Ediacaran, right? They don't have exoskeletons, are one of the early animals. So the Cambrian period was an evolutionary period, time of evolutionary experimentation. Okay, if you think about it, animal life is coming on the scene. And these are the first animals with exoskeletons, really the first complex animals. The world is open to them, the planet is open to them, right? There's no competition, yet they're just emerging on the scene. And so evolution goes in many different directions. So there's all these different sorts of body plans and designs that evolve. But eventually, as the populations increase, competition increases and natural selection starts to set in. And a lot of these body plans, they aren't as effective and they go extinct. And so few succeed. And the body plans that were successful, a lot of them are still around today. Right? So this early situation. It's kind of like an emerging market in business. Say, you know, a new technology is invented, like cellular phone technology, and then all these different people, companies start building cell phones, making cell phones. There's a lot of options in the market. But eventually the consumers like certain cell phones better than others because of certain features. And so those companies get larger portion of the market share. Eventually the smaller companies, they go extinct. So they go out of business or they go extinct. And the designs that people like, they become more and more dominant. And so then they're around today. So if you remember, like all the different types of cell phones, the Nokia ones, I don't know if you remember, those used to be out, or like a brick. Then you had the flip phone, and then eventually the touch screen, the smartphone. The consumers really like that so much that all the other cell phone designs pretty much don't exist anymore, right? So as new cell phone designs were produced, they were selected upon by the consumer, and the most preferable one, the one that was fittest, succeeds. And the same thing was occurring during the Cambrian. Nature began to select upon these features. Those that weren't not as competitive went extinct, and those that were competitive survived. So stromatolites, remember those structures formed by the photosynthetic bacteria? Well, these structures begin to take a nosedive in numbers during the Cambrian because of all these new animals that are grazing. They're eating the bacteria. So they decrease greatly in numbers in the Cambrian. And then also during the Cambrian, organisms that are specifically important to us come on the scene, like this Brachiopods. This is an organism that has a rudimentary spinal cord. You see this, like this on the line going through. It's like a notochord. So organisms like it are thought to be the earliest forms of chordates, or animals with a spinal cord, which is a phylum, and then vertebrates are a subphylum of it. Those that have bones around their spinal cord, like us. So this is thought to be in the Cambrian, one of the earliest forms of a chordate, or eventually a vertebrate. It's because all these other organisms, they're all invertebrates, like arthropod, and so vertebrates come on the scene in the Cambrian, but they're by no means the most dominant form of animal life. So this is not the ancestor which of the following: elephants, whales, humans, or snails? Well, the answer would be snails, because snails are an invertebrate, right? All the other three, elephants, whales, humans, are vertebrates. So they would descend from these early vertebrates, like this Brachiopods. So now, kind of do a little summary, look at life in the Proterozoic versus the Ediacaran versus the Cambrian. So going back to the Precambrian, the Proterozoic, we have stromatolites, right, the photosynthetic bacteria. And by the end of the Proterozoic, we have animal life, a very simple animal life, no durable skeletons, no exoskeletons, just made out of collagen. And then by the time of Cambrian comes, we have evolution of exoskeletons, so hard body parts. We also have organisms that can swim. We have some active predators. We even have the evolution of eyes. So it was a big jump in the Cambrian. That's why the Cambrian is such an important period of Earth history, is the evolution of complex animal life with hard structures, and a lot of the features that we see around today. So if you were a photographer living at the end of the Cambrian, which of the following organisms would be most common to take a picture of? Well, A is a plant living on land, those leaves. So there definitely were no organisms on land, not even plants. C is a fish, that's a vertebrate, and vertebrates are there's just a couple organisms that are beginning to evolve their vertebrates, so a long way from fish. And D, stromatolites, these are decreasing numbers because of all the animals grazing upon them. So B is a brachiopod. It is one of the most common Cambrian fossils, right? And so B would be the most common of all of these four, most likely to take a photograph of B. So that's our lecture on Precambrian Earth history and life, with a little bit of an intro to the Cambrian life.